everyone's favorite Zoom notification. There's one slide on this presentation somewhere that I haven't finished. I just couldn't find the slide. So when we find it, we'll all find it together. Anyways, welcome, folks. Two quick intro thingies, Majoodly Bob-Redoos, before we get started. The first is, let me just quickly shut off notifications so you're not all like blasted by random notifications. First thing really quickly, for those of you who weren't here last week, hi, I'm Ryan. Nice to meet you. We're going to have a lot of fun. I do encourage people to ask questions. People asked questions at the end of last time, but like you can ask questions at any point. So thank you, like Dan and Ming last time who like asked some questions. So y'all can do that whenever. Like you don't have to wait until I say, are there questions? Just ask questions. We all have questions. I have questions about myself. I'll sometimes pause and ask myself questions. Heck, I even do that in the middle of speeches sometimes. So please feel free to do that. Second thing, I meant to say this last time and then I forgot to. But just to be very clear, I'm not the Ministry of Truth when it comes to debate. I would love it if I was the Ministry of Truth when it came to debate. But unfortunately, I haven't yet figured out how to control the entire world. I'm still working on it. I'll let you know. Well, I guess I won't let you know if I figure it out because you'll just know because like my face will be plastered all over buildings and stuff. So, I guess there's that. But, basically the gist is like, long story short, like take everything I say with a grain of NaCl to the extent that like, I'm trying to give you advice. If you find that something else works better, then do that because that's awesome and that's very exciting. The only exception to this, of course, is like factual statements. Like if you want to run a bunch of like factually incorrect arguments, if it works, then like kudos to you, but I don't know, hasn't worked for me. Okay, 4 things we're going to do today, but it's really 3 because I really just wanted to be able to get in the getting yelled at by Gordon Ramsay line in there, but we're only really going to be doing 3 things. The first is talking about different types of emotions. The second is talking about content emotions. So very bland stock emotions, but also like narrative motions, environment motions, stuff like that. And then lastly, we're going to chat about the weird, wacky motions that periodically rear their ugly heads. Anyone who debates in New York knows this because like there's a massive obsession with running these like wacky motions that are like, Taylor Swift said this lyric, and then you're going to debate this topic about that lyric. And they're very wacky. So we're going to chat about those. So if at any point though, TLDR, ask questions. I'm more than happy with that. First thing, types of motions. We're going to talk about 3 types. I'm going to lump policy and analysis motions together, but we'll chat about policy debates, counterfactual debates, and then actor debates. It's so sad to me that they call them actor debates because like someone should set an actor motion about an actor. They should have like this house as a Hollywood actor, and then people can make puns about how it's an actor motion about actors. I haven't seen it yet. So we're going to first start by talking about policy/analysis motions. I'm going to be honest, every single BP tournament I've ever gone to uses like the same briefing slides. If you've seen it, you know it. It's like, what is BP debate? And then it goes to this like thing like, what are the different types of motions? And it's like analysis motions, policy motions. And they're almost the same exact thing with like one very small exception I'll mention later. But that's why I'm lumping them together, because if you can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, then you should do it. Or I saw the other day like a post by like PETA 2 or something. I don't even know what that is. I thought there was just one PETA. Apparently they've doubled. That was like, you shouldn't say that phrase. So I don't know. We'll talk about that more later in the environment section. First up is policy motions. Policy motions, more or less, basically are just, there is some problem in the status quo. We have a potential policy we can implement to solve it. The debate is about whether or not we solve that problem, plus positive benefits, negative harms in the motion, stuff like that. There's 3 things I'll chat about in the context of policy motions: identifying/solving problems. Then I'll talk a little bit about implementing solutions, and we'll talk a little bit about solving problems. Obviously, there's overlap between all 3 of them, but we're going to try to segregate them out and talk about them individually. So in terms of identifying problems, almost all policy motions in general are set because there is something that is kind of wonky with the status quo. And someone on the CA team, like the people setting motions, was like, we should try to fix it. It's very helpful in prep to ask yourself what that problem is, because that dictates and it guides how you think about the motion. So almost anytime you see this house believes that, or this house would, you should probably be starting to think about, why was this motion set and what problem is there under status quo that needs to be fixed in some way. Sometimes the problem will be really, really obvious. Like you'll have a motion like, this house would impose sanctions on X country. And in lots of instances, it's kind of clear like, oh, if you have this house would impose sanctions on Russia, it's very unlikely that anyone, unless you've been living under a literal rock, is like, oh, gee golly, I wonder what Putin did this time. but it's much more likely in other motions that you will have to seek out a little bit what that problem is. So for example, the first time I ever debated this House would abolish the Olympics, I hadn't had a lot of reading about problems with the Olympics. And so in that instance, it's not obviously clear what the specific harm you're trying to solve is. And that's where you need to ask yourself questions like, who is involved in this debate and what problems might they have with the way the world functions right now? In addition, though, to identifying what the problem is, as a government team, you also want to ask yourself two questions. A, how is society already currently working to address those problems? And B, how could an op team, either using Fiat or just using generic likelihood analysis, try to say that there are other ways to tackle the problem? Has anyone here, this is most likely to be a thing that you've picked up on if you are a Canadian. Have any of you watched the 2016 World's BP quarterfinal round? It's with Bowen Finale on OG. It's about the Black secessionary state. Has anyone watched that round? Fantastic round. Really, really wonderful round. Anyone? No? Well, I guess, okay, I was going to ask one of those really annoying, super specific questions that everyone's like, what do you mean? I don't know what answer you're looking for. Well, basically, if you watch the round, the motion is really wacky. It's like this House believes that the United States should support the creation of an independent secessionist country for African Americans. And opening government spends like a solid 2 minutes on just explaining why the status quo is so incontrovertibly fucked up that the only possible way that things can ever get better is to just create a whole new nation and give it to African Americans. A lot of people might look at that and might be confused why even out of prime minister, there's like 5 pieces of preemption to, but there are alternative thingy madoodly bobberoos that we can do. But if you actually think about it just persuasively, it makes a lot of sense. If Gov is saying, here is a problem and we should fix it in this way, in almost all instances, the natural response that debaters have, but also human beings have is, but there are other ways that we could fix the same problem in a much less bad way. So in that context, it's really helpful as Gov to explain why this is not just a way to solve a problem, but either the only way or the best way. And explaining why alternatives fail really narrows the debate to op has to defend a really bad system. We get to defend something that maybe has some potentiality to fail, but at least has a much greater likelihood of achieving some degree of efficacy and at least, sort of some degree of success. Also, FYI, if part of my screen is blurry, it's because I have the chat open. I'll try to keep it open as little as possible. Good example of this is, let's say you have a debate like this House would nationalize Amazon. The way that most Gov teams approach this is they'll stand up and they'll give a bazillion and a half reasons why Amazon really sucks. They pay their workers poorly, they destroy local businesses, they monopolize certain industries, they eventually raise prices, yada, yada, yada. The first thing that any good opposition team will say in response to that is like, oh yeah, man, we hate Jeff Bezos too, but that's why we should regulate Amazon. And most Gov teams, if they just ran a generic we hate Amazon case, rah, 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 now have to win the debate out of second Gov, because almost everything that a Gov team has identified about here are all the bad things that Amazon is doing currently, those all are true, but they're not being contested by a smart op team. And so now the impetus or the burden is on Gov to win the entire round out of a second Gov speech by explaining why comparatively nationalization is better than regulation. The much better solution is spend time in prep asking yourself, what are the other possible, most likely alternatives an opposition team might defend, and figure out how you'll either deal with them out of PM or how you would deal with them out of a second Gov speech, whatever you happen to call that in your respective formats. Take a different motion. I like this motion. It's a lot of fun. If you haven't debated it, you should. It's basically Batman, but no one can say Batman because the word Batman is technically mentioned nowhere in the motion, and it's a lot of fun. If you have some sort of motion that's basically like, this House believes that Batman is a real yay, the most likely Gov you'll get is a bunch of reasons why vigilantism in high crime, high corruption areas is good. Like, we will fight crime, we will beat criminals and kick their asses. What most opposition teams will then respond with is to be like, but there are other ways that we can try to solve the same problems that are much more effective, a la, for instance, giving lots of money to reform a broken policing system or try to improve local educational or economic opportunities for individuals living in that neighborhood. Again, this is not an unbeatable argument. This is not a special argument, and there's lots of good responses to it. But if you backload everything until like a second Gov speech, or you force your second Gov speaker to spend like 4 minutes of LO just brainstorming reasons why all of opposition's alternatives are going to fail, you're putting yourself in a really, really rough place because, like we talked about last week, you're no longer comparing efficacy to no efficacy, like the comparative. You're instead comparing, oh, here's one potential way of solving problems, which is vigilantism, to another potential way of solving problems, which is, for example, structural reform of a city like Gotham. And at that point in time, you as Gov are in a horribly disadvantageous position. And that's why I think there's a lot of benefit that comes from thinking about that question earlier on. So takeaway here is just, even in PM speeches, even in prep, spending some time thinking about why this is the best / and or only way to rectify whatever is really bad with status quo, good use of time. Even if that means you have to spend 2 or 3 minutes of prep sitting there being like, oh, what do you think Alp's going to say? Because it's a good strategy and a good thing to think about. Otherwise, you put your second. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you give us like some stock sort of responses to combat regulation or funding or stuff like that, stuff that Nello would bring up in this situation?
Yeah, so specifically on regulation, there's a document linked in the resources page, which I'll pop in chat. There's like 6 or 7 stock responses to regulation specifically, which is the most common op alternative. I think outside of that, you have to get clever. I think that almost always the easiest argument you can make for why current trends are failing is to point to very obvious problems in the status quo that indicate that whatever the status quo is doing is insufficient. So, for example, if you debate a motion about, say, reforming high school sports leagues in a way that attempts to make them, for instance, more inclusive to trans individuals or more inclusive to women, to equalize opportunities, there might just be a blunt way of framing a gov on whatever that motion might be, which is whatever trends op's going to point to are clearly ineffective. We see the scale of the problem under status quo and maybe give some nice illustrations of that. In terms of actually beating real op comparatives like, but here's a different way that we can solve this, you need to think a little bit more clearly about why the status quo is the way it is. So it's often the case that things don't happen randomly. Like, in most instances, the reason why the world is kind of messed up in some ways is because there's someone who wants it to be messed up in that way. So, for example, maybe you're debating a motion about over-policing or about very excessive drug laws. It's not like randomly, like, a bunch of like representatives in Congress just sat back one day and were like, oh, gee, golly, it would be real great if we locked up a bunch of African Americans or whatever. Like, they got there because there's lobbying from the private prison sector. They got there because there's a tough on crime electorate that wants to vote them into office, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. So asking yourself, why is the status quo the way it is? Thinking about who's responsible for it, and then figuring out why whatever alternatives op wants to propose just won't work in that context works pretty nicely. So, for example, because everyone's favorite like debater is Bo, A, because he's very cool, B, because he just wrote a book, and C, because his accent is incredibly lovely. Like, if you watch any of his speeches, almost everything he does, especially out of prime minister speeches, is like, here's 5 or 6 reasons why the status quo is bad, because the media is controlled by white people, because capitalism exists, and whatever. I'm butchering his arguments, and I'm also not using his cool Australian Korean accent, but you get the gist. So basically asking yourself, why is the status quo the way it is, and then brainstorming how to deal with that can be, I think, a good strategy for dealing with kind of like, oh, but here's what op will say. So now that we spent a bunch of time dunking on alternatives, let's chat about how to use them strategically on op. So on any policy motion, a la this house would, this house believes that X should do Y thing, as opposition teams, you get equivalent amounts of fiat power to do something else. Now, I'm not going to get into the really ugly California style debates, which are like, oh, but your counterplan is not okay for the following wacky, wonko, weird reasons. But like, basically the gist is like, as an opposition team running some sort of counterplan / counterprop, you want to make sure that whatever you're standing for is mutually exclusive. And when I say mutually exclusive, you've probably heard the term. It basically just means you can't both do gov and op at the same time. So as a quick note, if you ever need a cop-out of a reason why you can't do both the plan and the counterplan at the same time, the kind of stock reason I've run many times that judges seem to be somewhat receptive to is like, there's limited political capital to do certain things. So for example, let's say you have a motion about environmentalism and gov is like, we should implement a carbon tax. And maybe you as op are like, no, we should not implement a carbon tax, but let's implement this other environmental policy. Maybe it doesn't technically trade off with the carbon tax, like you theoretically could do both. But in the context of real world politics, in most instances, there's limited political support for environmentally cool, swaggy things. And as a consequence, even if you theoretically could do both, you really can't. You can either do a carbon tax, or you could do, I don't know, a cap and trade system, or I don't know, some other subsidization for green renewable energy, whatever that happens to look like. So often you can point to the limited political capital, especially when it comes to doing things that are good for example, marginalized groups, good for the environment, good for the least well-off members of society. You can often use that as like a little bit of like a squiggle out of like defending or having to like be like, oh, but your counter plan isn't mutually exclusive. The other thing that you want to be cautious of, though, is that a lot of op teams will do this thing where the case they run will be against Gov's case. So they'll be like, here's a bunch of reasons why the motion in abstract is bad, but then the counter plan they run kind of knifes that. So if you have a motion like limit religious schools to religious instruction, if you straight op this, i.e. without any sort of counter plan, maybe you make some sort of argument about religious backlash. If you then counterplan and have a bunch of stringent regulations on what religious schools can do and whether or not they can allow religion to influence their teachings, yada, 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 or whatever, like that's going to knife or at least optically knife your own counterplan. The other thing I want to point out is that oftentimes there's this lazy response that second Gov speakers will give to counterplans, which is oftentimes counterplans will go something like this. Gov will be like, there is big problem in status quo. Let's do really big thing to solve it. And op will be like, we agree there is big problem in status quo. Let's do slightly less crazy thing to solve it. And a lot of second Gov speakers will respond to op counterplans by being like, oh, well, you ran all these arguments about things like backlash, but you forgot that those things happen on your side too, because counterplan. In most instances, that's where it's really helpful as an op team to be like, yes, we concede that, for example, anytime you implement an environmentally good policy, there will be some degree of backlash. The question is the extent to which that backlash manifests. And intuitively, in most instances, there is a difference between the amount of, for example, backlash you'll get from like doing a very moderate policy compared to like a really crazy radical thing or whatever. So often identifying why, even if rhetorically it seems like your counterprop mitigates your own arguments, why there is a scalar difference between you compared to Gov. Other thing is, it's often an easier thing to do as op to not outright defend a specific counterprop, but to instead explain why there are ongoing trends that mitigate whatever the problem Gov points to is. So for example, if you have a motion like this House supports the European Union's decision to ban imports of Russian oil, maybe you're op and you want to run arguments about why this specific sanction is bad, but you also want to co-opt some of the Gov benefits about ending the war in Ukraine. It might be a good strategy not to defend some specific counterplan, but to instead give structural reasons why the status quo and why existing sanctions are at least maybe kind of good enough that we can get some degree of efficacy and we don't have to trade off all the bad things with this specific sanction. Other thing, practicing this is really helpful. So we're going to do like a little bit of group practice here. I know there's like 39 of you or something here, but like y'all can talk. I don't care. I mean, if you care, then like, I don't know, don't talk, but that would be really sad. So for example, if you have a motion like this House would invade Myanmar, what existing alternatives can op point to and be like, we don't need to invade Myanmar if there are bad things happening in Myanmar? Yeah, beautiful, wonderful, exactly, right? Op can just be like, sanctions already exist. If you have this House would abolish the Olympic Games, this is a slightly more worked example. Like, what do you think opposition is presumably going to say? You don't have to give me uber specifics, but big picture. Anyone want to guess? Yeah, Jeffrey.
Make sure the Olympic Games are held in like uncorrupt countries.
Yeah, so TLDR is like reform the bidding process, limit who can host the Olympics, like basically implement a bunch of reforms to make the system better. Maybe you have a motion like prohibit the media from reporting on mental illnesses of people who are accused of crimes. Similar thing there, right? Like maybe we don't outright ban the media, maybe we just implement like codes, like ethical codes and requirements that the media is expected to, kind of adhere to. And like these are instances where, again, you can concede that a problem exists. Myanmar is run by a dictatorial military autocracy. The Olympics are currently bad in terms of the bidding process, sports washing, etc. The media currently does report poorly on the mental illness of people who are accused of crimes. You can agree to the existence of problems and offer different, more tailored, and more specific solutions. And that's why oftentimes being op can be very helpful, because you can make the better arguments for the better types of solutions. So instead of having to defend the often hardcore Gov, you can defend a more selective policy on an alternative basis and explain why that's better, etc. While we're on the subject, I want to quickly chat about fiat power. Fiat power is something that, thank God, whoever decided to invent Canadian debate didn't make a big thing. But fiat power is a thing that comes up a decent bit in American debate. And okay, quick side note, I mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm not the expert on debate. I do have a lot of opinions on debate. This is one of my opinions. You're free to accept it. You're free to ignore it. And if you're on California, you should probably at least somewhat selectively ignore it, because enough, I think, of some of your debates have to do with fiat. But I want to quickly chat about fiat power and some general ideas on it. In order to do that, I decided to pull out a nice old story. Anyone ever heard of Goldilocks? Has no one heard of Goldilocks?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So I have decided that we will retell Goldilocks, this time from a debate perspective. I'll read aloud. All right. Once upon a time, Goldilocks was walking through the forest when she came across an empty debate cottage. Because she's a creepy stalker, she decided to break in because that's illegal, and that's exactly what Goldilocks loves to do. When Goldilocks entered, she saw 3 steaming bowls of porridge motions on the table in front of her. She goes, oh my gosh, I love this, decides to sit down and eats them because she's, again, a creepy stalker. She tries the first bowl of jargony econ motion porridge. She goes, holy shit, this is awful. She tries the next one and says, similarly, this is terrible. Then she eats a delicious spoonful of balanced IR politics, and she's like, oh, this is delicious. Don't worry, this is not the part I want you to pay attention to. Then she decides to go into the living room, and she decides to sit on a series of couches because, you know, she's very eager, much like debaters who just copy and paste motions into Google. She tries on a few different types of weighing couches. She decides, aha, the love seat of weighing on long-termism is great, and like, woohoo, hooray, hurrah. Then lastly, she goes to the bedroom, and there are 3 beds. Again, this is a classic bedtime story. Every parent tells it to their kids. And she tries out 3 different levels of fiat. The first is gov teams that decide to run excessive amounts of fiat and drop the word fiat every time they can't come up with a warrant for something. Then she remembers, oh, wait a second, this is English format debate, not Latin style debate. And she is not, as a matter of fact, debating Cicero. And every time she says a Latin word, her judge cringes even more. Then she decides to go too hardcore to the other side and instead is overly skimpy on fiat. And similarly, her judges are incredibly irate at her. Finally, she eventually goes to the final fiat bed, which has enough fiat power for the motion to be implemented well without so much fucking fiat power that the entire round becomes an ugly, awful, ugly definitions debate that literally no one ever likes. So the TLDR conclusion of all of this basically is just, as a gov team, fiat power is cool. You get to assume the motion passes. Every additional time you say the word fiat power, it's not necessarily a bad thing, especially if op challenges you on it. It's just that the more and the more that you rely on fiat, the less and less like argumentatively sound your case becomes. I want to be clear. I have no problem with fiat power. Fiat power is a lovely, wonderful, amazing thing. And thank you, fiat. We love you, fiat. But every additional time you warrant a crucial contingency in your case on fiat makes your case a decent bit weaker. You can also order the book online. Just kidding, you can't. I wrote it. Did everyone like story time? I really like story time. Anyways, the only other takeaway I want to quickly flag here is that a lot of teams will do this kind of thing where it's almost like they're like, what's a good analogy? It's like kind of like that thing where like, you know how when you're like really tired and you're like sitting on the couch and the remote is like just out of reach and you're like, and you can't get it. And then you're just like, oh, I give up. A lot of teams do that in debate where they kind of do this thing either as gov or on op where they'll be like, wow, this thing just can't be or can be like this thing can't be fiated as gov. And they'll just like give up on the argument. No, the fact that something can't be fiated into existence doesn't mean that you can't say, oh, this thing is likely to happen, right? So a good example of this is like, let's say you have a motion that's like, this house prefers a world where X technology exists, right? A lot of gov teams will be like, oh, shucks, we can't like do a super extensive plan for how we're going to regulate this. Yeah, you can't fiat a plan in, but like, no, duh, a world where that technology exists is also very likely to be a world where there are organic political incentives to regulate that technology. So again, I apologize for sounding overly intense, but like in most instances, even if you can't fiat something, you can still try to explain why it's likely. I'll give a different example. I once watched a debate on the topic, the United States government should make the should basically implement a 30-hour work week. So like anything above 30 hours counts as overtime, you get paid extra. And the gov team, this is an American parley round, gov team defines it as, we will exclude small businesses from this debate. And op had an argument on small businesses planned. And like the argument like meekly dies out of the debate. And they're like, we can't run our, and that was like sad because yeah, it's true that maybe gov fiats small businesses out of the debate. But that doesn't take the argument on small businesses out of the debate. It just changes how you make it. So instead of the small business argument on op being, oh, well, now small businesses have to pay their workers more and that harms them, the way you get there just changes slightly. So instead of the mechanism being now overtime pay costs more, therefore small businesses are harmed, the argument is the same, it just made differently. So maybe you, for example, say, in order for small businesses to stay economically competitive with larger businesses, they still have to increase wages, because if you just wanted to work at Walmart down the road, they would be offering you overtime on any hours worked above 30 hours. And so in most instances, fiat is actually not as powerful as people think it is. And in most instances, either way, on gov or on op, you can use like likelihood analysis as a fine substitute for just saying Latin words. To be clear, I did take Latin throughout high school. It's a very cool language. That being said, my teacher never taught us Latin, so I don't know any Latin. So in case any of you wanted to ask me Latin questions, I can't do that. Last thing I want to chat about in the context of policy motions is implementation. I want to be clear because I have a bunch of slides written on this. When I say implementation and challenging implementation, I don't mean that you should ever challenge the fiat power of a gov team, which is just something I spent several minutes yelling at you about. So I'm sorry for yelling at you about your fiat power. But the point that I'm going to basically try to make here is just like thinking about how motions get implemented and making arguments based upon that. So like I flagged, you can't contest the fiat power that a gov team has to implement the motion. But that doesn't mean that you can't make arguments about how the motion gets implemented, and more importantly, how it gets perceived by the public. So I'll give kind of a common example of this. I think that in lots of motions about social justice, what often happens is this. A lot of motions will be written in the format, this House as X social justice movement would embrace Y narrative, where Y narrative is some really crazy extreme thing that probably is in line with the goals of the movement, but a lot of moderates will be alienated by. Like this House as the feminist movement would support X belief, or this House as the LGBTQ movement would support this belief, or whatever, right? In a lot of cases, I think gov teams would be really, really benefited by explaining why, independent of fiat, the activists who implement this motion have incentives to communicate it smartly. So let's have a motion like, let's say, for example, this House as the feminist movement would openly oppose the dominant norm of monogamy. A lot of gov teams struggle on this motion because they lose to the op argument that says this will result in feminists shaming women who engage in monogamous relationships. A pretty clever way to frame this debate as gov is to say the feminists who implement this motion have no incentive to frame this in a really terrible, demonic, demonizing, harsh way, because that harms them. That harms their movement. That harms their political perception, which means, if anything, as the feminists implementing the motion, you have all of the good incentives in the world to do a pretty good job of implementing this motion. So long story short, TLDR, it can often be decently helpful to think about how the motion gets implemented and to talk about that. A few kind of specific examples of that we're going to walk through. First motion, this House believes criminal punishment should basically be based on like how actually culpable you are, like to what extent did you intend to commit a crime, as opposed to the consequences from that punishment. So just as a quick illustration of this, if one of you dies from laughter because I'm just that funny, that would not be an instance where I had any intent to kill you. But the instance in which someone forcibly, like, I don't know, like stabs you in the heart with a knife results in the same outcome, but there is a differing level of moral culpability because they didn't have the intent to kill you. I don't think I'm going to kill any of you with my jokes. If I do, please do let me know. Anyways. Also, quick thing for folks, FYI, I think I mentioned this a while back, but I just got one quick question in chat on this. Fiat is basically just the power a gov team has to assume the motion gets implemented. So this House would repeal the Second Amendment in the United States. This motion will happen literally never, ever, ever. But if all that op had to do to win the debate was to stand up and be like, guys, this will never happen, the debate would be really stupid because the judge would be like, oh, you're right. And then the debate would be over. So fiat assumes that gov can implement a motion. The debate then becomes a question of whether or not the debate like is good or bad. Like, would it be a good or bad thing to implement a repeal of the Second Amendment? What I just talked about is why you shouldn't overextend your fiat power as gov. Quickly back to this. Criminal punishments based on culpability as opposed to outcomes. The debate that most people have on this motion goes something like this. Gov gives a bunch of reasons why punishing based on culpability is good. Op gives a bunch of reasons why punishing based on consequences is good. That's fine. But if you actually pause and think to yourself, how does this motion get implemented? It can yield some pretty interesting arguments. So this is not a debate where courts just are guaranteed to have epistemic access into the thoughts of every defendant. So like, if a court is trying me, for example, because like I totally slaughtered Jared with all of my really funny memes, they don't have any ability to read my mind. So there's an implementation problem in this motion. How does a court come to understand whether or not an offender is culpable? And how does a court come to understand the consequences of an offender's actions? And that can lead to some pretty interesting arguments. So for example, on op, you might make arguments that say, look, this is not really a debate about punishing based on consequences versus culpability. It's a debate about punishing based on courts' understanding of culpability as opposed to courts' understanding of consequences, i.e. there's an implementation issue here. And as an op team, you might say, look, courts are going to do a really, really bad job of coming to understand culpability if you're punishing exclusively based on culpability, that is. And that's going to result in a lot of, for example, racist decisions. You're going to get a lot of instances of juries believing that, I guess this is just a criminal sentencing motion, so judges believing that certain individuals had more intent than others, whereas, at least on paper maybe, consequences are at least a wee bit more objective, which makes it easier to implement this fairly. Again, this is not an argument that challenges that Gov has the right to do the motion or that they can assume the motion happens. It's just a question of assuming the motion can be done, will it be done well, and how will it end up being done? Different motion. I'm not going to actually cover this, but you can kind of read about it. Like, for example, just think about the process of negotiating bilateral versus multilateral agreements, as opposed to just thinking about the outcomes of those sorts of things. Sorry, I'm going to skip over this just for the sake of time. Last one that you could kind of think of is like, for example, if you have a motion about banning the consumption/production of meat, there's a lot of good op arguments you can make, which is like, yes, Gov gets to fiat this ban is enforced. That doesn't mean they can't, in some sort of capacity, like make arguments about the black market arising and what happens as a consequence of that, et cetera. These are two other examples, but you can read them later. Anyways, so all of the stuff I just talked about is how you can make arguments either on Gov or op about the act of implementing a motion. The other part of policy motions that we haven't yet discussed is how do you actually prove solvency? Like, there is a problem that is very sad. How do we fix it? So this is my personal debate opinion. It's not fact. It's just my opinion. I think most teams, even really new teams, are actually very good at identifying problems. Like, if you ever debated against those like first-time novices who like want to sound that like they're like Abraham Lincoln or whatever, they'll get up and they'll like give like a booming rendition of "Give me liberty or give me death," and everyone will be like kind of a little bit internally cringing, but everyone will be like, "Oh wow, okay, this kid knows that like whatever, the United States is like spying on all of us all the time or whatever." Low key, I'm not saying I'm a conspiracy theorist, but if someone proves in like 10 years that Siri is secretly recording all of our messages, all I'm saying is I'm not going to be surprised. Anyways, only other conspiracy theory I believe in, I think, and let me think, what is the other conspiracy theory I believe in? I don't know. There's like one funny one. I forget what it is. If I remember, I'll come back to it. Are there any good conspiracy theories I should believe in that I don't know of? I don't think so. Maybe. I think Tabroom sometimes conspires against debaters for no good reason, but that's just pure speculation. Birds aren't real. I wrote a college essay about that. Maybe that's why it was such a weird essay. Anyways, it's a very funny debate. You should all, there's like a very funny XSTEM speech on that topic from a while back. So if you Google like birds aren't real, you get a pretty funny speech on it. It's very good. Anyways, long story short, okay, how do you prove solvency? Teams are really great at identifying the problem. The question is, how do you prove it? Like prove that you fix it. The biggest thing I think I'd say is like, I know this sounds stupid, and I know like good debaters are probably like, "Duh, I know this," but like spend time and prep on it. Like I'm guilty of this too. Like teams will be like, "Okay, what's the problem? What's the problem? Oh my gosh, I thought of a really cool argument. Here's a really big problem with the Olympics." And then you kind of won't always do as much time in prep actually thinking about how you solve it. And so in lots of instances, like just like be clear on that, like talk about how you actually solve things and just spend time in prep. The other thing I'm going to say, and this is like a kind of personal pet peeve more than anything, but I'm going to say it because I kind of want to say it, and I'm going to shout at you face to face for a second just to say it really authoritatively. So American debaters, I'll ask this question to you because this seems to, I'm sorry for generalizing all debate. I guess I do that more than I should, but in American debate, does anyone know what the most like one of the most common responses to any argument about like solving climate change is? Like the classic thing a bunch of debaters will say.
Non-unique.
Yeah, like Isha, yeah.
Like we can't.
Yeah, exactly. Like you got it. So the way that a bunch of American debaters will respond to arguments about solving climate change is like, what are you talking about? You can't solve climate change. And like, duh, obviously you're right. Like, I don't think any team can ever solve climate change unless like, I was talking with this person earlier today. He has an APTA case on this house would blow up the moon. It's a meme case, of course. And the whole point of the case is like, by blowing up the moon will like stops like tides or something, and then we'll like save the planet.
Sea level rise.
Yes, exactly. We should definitely do that. Just kidding, just kidding. That would be really bad for the cheese industry. I mean, where do you think they got all the cheese? Duh, it's from the moon. Anyways, like a bunch of American debaters. Okay, sorry. I won't blame this on Americans. Sorry, I blame everything on Americans. Debaters in general do this thing that's like, like you can't solve climate change, you can't solve racism. Like, yeah, you can, but you can still make a dent in the problem, right? Like maybe you can't stop climate change, but if we can make temperatures rise only 1.5 degrees as opposed to 2 degrees, that's still a kind of like big dub. So it's often useful whenever you're making arguments to even just at the very bottom of an argument include like a sentence that's like, Judge, we don't need to convince you that we solve climate change, that we end racism, that we fix institutionalized homophobia. We just have to prove we make it better. And so don't confuse solvency with absolute solvency. There's kind of a difference, and that difference is, I think, fairly important. The question then becomes, how do you actually prove that? I think the kind of biggest thing to do is to really dig into why problems exist and try to talk about why you solve them. So like I mentioned before in response to your question, Jared, in most instances, when gov teams identify here's a problem and then try to ask themselves, why is the status quo not solving that problem? It often can be helpful to kind of like at least think a little bit about, okay, well, here's why we're not currently solving the problem. There are causes that explain that. How do we affect those causes in some sort of way, right? So for example, if you have some motion about policing behavior and you say the underlying culprit here is, say, the private prison industry, maybe you want to make an argument about how do you change the incentives of the private prison industry or reform a certain set of prisons in a way that's particularly good. Or the motion I put here is like, if you have a debate about how do you embolden protest movements and authoritarian regimes, maybe you try to identify your thesis for why protest movements currently don't succeed, explain what those causes are, and then link the motion to the solution to whatever those underlying problems happens to be. Again, it's kind of trivial, but trying to structure prep in a way that is less conducive or like less susceptible to just like random volatile swings and how creative your mind can be is a pretty helpful way of trying to prove solvency. There's two other things I'll quickly flag. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on them, but if anyone wants me to explain these more, I'd be happy to at the end. One of them is talking about signaling effects. I think that it's often a much softer mechanism to run, but can often be useful. So people tend to underestimate the power that governments especially have, not just over like doing policy, but also influencing the way that people think about policy. So for example, when the United Kingdom abolished the death penalty, within like 2 years, public support for the death penalty went from like 70-something% to like 20-something%. And it's often the case that, people influence governments, but governments also influence people. So you can often make arguments about the signaling effect generated by a policy. And you can often talk about when we implement this policy, what signal does it send to society or to corporations or blah, blah, blah. And then you can sort of, talk, more generally about the kind of implication of that and stuff. Other thing that you can always talk about is how different people respond to policies, right? So for example, there's this really cheap argument that it's not a great argument, but I think debaters could run it more because a lot of other debaters don't respond well to it, which is like, there's this cheap argument that you'll sometimes hear university debaters make, myself included, to be clear, I'm guilty of this, where if the motion is like, this house believes that the government should do this policy that's good for a social movement, you can then make arguments about how this like emboldens that social movement because they then feel like their efforts have finally paid off, and that then results in more advocacy, more activism, more protest, which then leads to more change, and it's a positive feedback loop, yada, yada, yada. So you can often talk about how responses to policies by different groups of people then further contributes to the solution and stuff like that. A much better example of this is any motion about the environment. So for example, if you can ever, like as a gov team, say, this motion will incentivize companies to invest more into green technology or researching green technology like renewables, you can then impact that out a lot. Because if you can, for example, say the impact of this is not just companies switch to renewables, it's also all of a sudden when lots of companies start to pour money into researching, say, more efficient solar panels, the end implication is that we get lower costs, more efficient outcomes, et cetera, which means lots of other companies, other countries, other institutions start using this as well. And again, this becomes a positive sort of feedback loop. So talking about how different groups respond to motions and how that amplifies the efficacy of your response, I think can often be quite useful. Yes, I know that's like very generic, but it's at least a good thing to be thinking about vaguely. Okay, before we move on to talking about the two other types of motions, which admittedly will be a lot briefer, quick pause for questions if anyone has kind of general questions on where we've been at so far. I would count down, but that seems creepy. Delightful. Cool. All right, I'm going to switch back. Okay, next thing we're going to chat about is counterfactual debates and kind of general advice on them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because almost everything we talked about last week in terms of comparative analysis is very, very similar to counterfactual debates. As a quick note, because I don't think I have a slide on this, counterfactual is almost the same word as comparative. The only reason why they're kind of different terms is that the term counterfactual admittedly is much less prevalent in American parliamentary debate, so probably is a bit riskier to use. Counterfactual is a term that you'll hear very specifically used on this House regrets motions to explain like what the alternative narrative or the alternative norm or the alternative belief would have happened to have been. So quickly just explaining what counterfactual debates are. Almost always they're this House regrets motions. They also can sometimes be this House supports or opposes motions. But the important thing about them is that they're never policy debates. They're never like this House believes the government should do X policy. They tend to be retrospective motions that kind of like ask questions about norms, beliefs, ideas, policies that exist or have existed, and whether the world is better or worse off as a consequence of them. In terms of counterfactuals, we covered a lot of this last week, but I'll quickly review it in case you weren't there. Basically, whenever you have this House regrets debates, you're never really just debating that this House regrets the thing that we're regretting. You're implicitly comparing it to something else. That something else is what's called a counterfactual. So if you have a motion like this House regrets the portrayal of frontline workers during COVID as heroes, you're not just comparing glorification of frontline workers as heroes to like nothing. You're obviously comparing it to something else. Most debates, in all honesty, tend to do this thing where they're like, we should compare glorifying frontline workers to not glorifying frontline workers. And that's fine because that's honestly kind of like a pseudo comparative, but identifying very explicitly what the alternative attitude or norm or belief would happen to be is often very, very useful, as I'll explain in a second. So just to quickly review, this is very similar to the idea of comparatives from last week. So very honestly, they're basically the same thing. I'll just flag a couple of kind of nuances that are useful. The first thing I'll chat about is how you actually come up with smart and kind of effective counterfactuals. In almost all instances, the best strategy, I think, to do this is to ask yourself who is responsible for the norm or narrative or policy that's being debated. So what do I mean by that? Let's say you have a motion like this House regrets the glorification of hard work. I can't emphasize enough that there is no like, it's not like you walk down the street and you're like, ooh, there's a narrative. And then like the narrative like seeps into your skin. And then you're like Peter Parker and you like become like a superhero who's like, I love hard work or whatever. Like that's not how narratives exist, right? Narratives exist because of things like the media. They exist because of things like education systems. They exist because of just things that are passed down generation to generation or through context or through interpersonal relationships. And the question you should ask yourself is, who is actually responsible for pushing some narrative or pushing some belief? And in almost all instances, either that narrative is pushed by kind of like society writ large. So like media companies, whoever designs the educational curriculum, blah, 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 or it's pushed by a very specific group of people. So I'll kind of talk about both of these in turn. So type one would kind of be like narratives, beliefs, or policies that are kind of like supported or kind of like given rise to because a lot of institutions in society support them. So if you have a motion like this House opposes the belief that like sacrifice is a crucial component of love or whatever, or like whatever the motion happens to be. I borrowed it from this past year's Euros. Like this narrative exists because of like a bunch of disparate factors, right? Like books say this, TV shows say this, interviews, celebrities, like Ryan talking to you during like summer debate presentations. That's how this narrative gets communicated to people. So when you're trying to conceptualize, well, what is the alternative or what is the counterfactual? The other narrative that otherwise would have filled the void if we never had this narrative that love requires sacrifice would be molded by those same institutions, right? So like in other words, if media wasn't saying love requires sacrifice, media would just be saying something else instead. What else would they be saying instead? That's your comparative. That's your counterfactual. In other instances, it's not true that like everyone in society is like in on this big old game of narrative construction. This house regrets the demonization of the rich. Like, it's not true that like all books, all TV shows, all interviews and whatever are saying, we hate the rich. Like, it's a somewhat smaller-ish kind of mini group of like debaters and, oh, did I say debaters? So the point kind of is like, in this debate, this house regrets the demonization of the rich. The counterfactual is not going to be molded by like, Times Magazine or like, Bill Gates or whatever. It's going to be molded by the same leftists and socialists who currently demonize the rich. So the comparative in that debate is not like, is it better to demonize the rich or respect the rich? The comparative is probably like, is it better to demonize the rich or criticize the rich, but perhaps in a less demonizing tone? So maybe when we demonize the rich, we say things like eat the rich. Maybe the counterfactual is not, we go, I love you, Elon Musk. Instead, the counterfactual is something like, for example, you know what? We hate you, Elon Musk. But instead of saying like we should like whatever bring back the French Revolution, let's instead talk about the specific structural reasons we don't like Elon Musk or whatever it happens to be. I also apologize to like the many, many years of people who saw that my Google profile image was a Tesla logo. I had a big Tesla phase when I was in the 4th grade, and I changed my Google image to a Tesla logo and never changed it back. So in case you were worried I was an Elon Musk fanboy, don't worry, I'm not. I think I have some examples here. Yeah, okay, let's quickly chat. Let's do some examples. Woohoo, yay, everyone loves examples. I'm only gonna do 1 of the 3 of them because I'm a little bit lazy. Let's say we have a motion like this house supports a belief that all people are redeemable. Anyone want to like give me an idea what a counterfactual might look like for this motion? Like any ideas in general?
It could be that having confidence is a virtue instead of having humility.
Oh, for the first one? Yeah, for sure. So maybe we say that instead of glorifying humility, we glorify confidence for sure. Absolutely. That's fantastic. Yeah, we'll skip ahead there, right? Like, yeah, so maybe you say, for example, I was thinking specifically of like, how do we then treat humility? But you're right. Maybe we instead glorify or say that being confident is virtuous. That's a great example. These are like some ideas of counterfactuals and stuff like that. And again, like this helps a lot. Like having good counterfactual analysis is really, really freaking helpful. So I want to go through an interesting example of this that I think is overlooked in almost every iteration of this debate. I guarantee you that you'll debate this motion at some point in your career or some iteration of it. This house regrets China's Belt and Road Initiative. If you don't know what the BRI is, don't worry about that. I'm going to cover it exhaustively, like really exhaustively in a few weeks. But TLDR, it's a huge series of like investment projects, infrastructure projects, et cetera, that have been launched by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party out of China. The typical debate that most people have is BRI good versus BRI bad. And you can't blame them for that, right? You can't blame people for being like, well, that's the debate, right? One side is pro-BRI, one side is anti-BRI. But if you actually re-envision the debate, you realize it's a little bit more interesting, right? Most teams want to make this debate about whether China expanding is good or China expanding is bad. But that's not really the debate, right? Because if the motion is this house regrets the BRI, Gov will say, here's a bunch of reasons why China's incentives are bad. But it's not as if the BRI causes those bad incentives. The BRI is just the manifestation of China's incentive, like interest in expanding power, yada, yada. So as an op team, you could say something kind of radical, which is like, look, we agree that the BRI has real serious problems, but counterintuitively, oddly enough, this is not really is the BRI good or bad debate. It mostly is. But there's also another tier to the debate, which is in a world without the BRI, what instead happens? And maybe an op team says somewhat cleverly, look, if China wants to expand, they'll expand on either side. The question is just how. We would rather China decides to expand its influence within Asia, for example, by building railroads and ports, rather than, for example, bullying or even militarily harassing other countries into conceding to Chinese hegemony, as perhaps China has done in the context of places a la Hong Kong, a la the South China Sea. Now, again, I'm not saying that's a great counterfactual. The point is just taking that can be really, really useful and can often turn otherwise hard to win rounds into pretty interesting, easy to win rounds. Any questions on counterfactual type stuff? I know this is all very abstract. So if folks have questions, please feel free to ask. Yeah, David.
Yeah. This is really informative. Going back to the BRI example, I feel like that's a bit hard to like, how would you analyze the incentives of China to like, take power in a more abusive ways versus like potentially Gov might say they might take it in a more diplomatic way.
Yeah, so to be clear, Gov can run the same thing. They'll just frame it very differently, right? So a Gov team, for instance, might be like, maybe instead of expanding through military expansionism, China will instead expand through like diplomatic means, right? I think that this becomes a, what are the incentives, the CCP debate type thing at that point, right? So presumably what OP might push, counterintuitively, of course, is like, here's why the underlying incentives of China are actually quite bad. So maybe you, for example, talk about like very specific notions of like, why Xi Jinping has bad incentives. So you, for example, could talk about the fact that the CCP is internally divided into kind of three main groups, and Xi Jinping's group has only really come to power since the kind of mid 2000s. And he's still very much vying for control. And the way he's primarily vied for control, if you look at his track record, is almost exclusively through very strong and kind of brutal displays of force. So, like, for example, it's almost definitely not in China's economic interest to be this aggressive in its stance towards Taiwan. But a lot of analysts speculate that at least part of the reason Xi Jinping has been very vehement, Vietnam, I don't know, in his stance towards Taiwan is because the way that he consolidates power internally within the kind of political bartering scheme of the CCP is through very forceful displays of power. Again, this is counterintuitive because OP is the pro-BRI team, but if you want to say, for example, the counterfactual ways that Xi Jinping tries to expand power, not just internationally, but also as a show of force to other CCP party technocrats, and even to people domestically within China, especially for whom within like the Han Chinese majority, at least some of them have a very like supportive view of notions of returning to a strong like era of China, blah, blah, blah. Like, again, the point is like you could take that argument and say, here's why the underlying incentive of Xi Jinping or the CCP is bad. Here's why that results in a worse outcome. This debate is probably a bad example of the here's how you run clever comparatives, because the level of specificity required to pull that argument off is probably quite difficult. But the kind of general idea, just more bluntly, is like, as an op team in this debate, maybe you say China still expands, just expands in worse ways. Gov runs the flip, which is China expands in good ways. So, for example, maybe Gov says things like China wants to frame itself as oppositional to the neoliberal Western order. And one of the main criticisms China has of the West is that it has historically acted in very imperial and expansionistic ways. That means that China has an incentive to frame and portray itself as not as expansionist, not as like oppositional towards the sovereignty of these countries. Hence, China's most likely counterfactual means of expanding are better, a la bilateral diplomacy, maybe like aid as opposed to, kind of unconditional projects, whatever it happens to be. I'll talk more about the BRI extensively when we do like the BRI thingy, but just kind of an idea. Anyways, so that's kind of like that. I did put this, I wanted to put the wicked template in because I spent a lot of time photoshopping that and I wanted to make it in. Okay, there we go. Anyways, last thing we're going to chat about, this will be super brief, on types of motions, actor specific debates. These debates are very similar to policy debates. The difference is that whenever I say the phrase actor debate, I basically just mean this house is already defined in the motion and you're basically just debating about the interests of this house. So obviously these debates are first and foremost centered around what the interests of an actor are. I don't know, I messed up the English there. But basically the gist is, I think a lot of teams, and again, I'm getting on my like high horse here, but I'll say it anyways. I think it can be really useful for a lot of teams to spend more time in prep actually thinking about the interests of actors. Like a lot of teams will get emotions like this house as blah, 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 and they'll just immediately go into arguments, and that's fine. But like, you need to first figure out what the actual framing for the round is. And in order to do that, you really want to spend time thinking about what the interests of the actor really are before you can start making arguments, because maybe you make arguments and they're great arguments, but if they don't really apply to the central interest of the actor, it doesn't help that much. Now, to be clear, like in a lot of these debates, it's kind of intuitive what the interests of an actor are. So if you have a motion like, I don't know, this house is a company, you probably can say that their primary incentive is to make money. But if you have a motion that's like this house is Biden, or this house is the United States, or this house is China, Russia, blah, 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 it gets a little bit trickier. And that's where you want to start brainstorming different types of interests. You want to think about how this actor has behaved in the past. So how has China behaved in the past? How has Biden behaved in the past? And you also want to think about kind of prioritizing different interests, which is something I'll chat about in just a second. Other thing, quick thought, is you want to keep interests real. So I think a common example of this in NYPDL debates is that there are a lot of motions that NYPDL sets that are like this house as a high school student. And for some reason, almost all of these debates devolve into this kid is a person who is literally going to like actually self-implode if they don't get into Stanford. And like, it's true that like, like there's like a bunch of debaters who are like gung-ho on like getting a 4.0 and going to an Ivy. Okay, that's hypocritical, Ryan. But anyways, like the point basically is like, there's some extent to which like the average high school student is not shotgunning the Ivies. And so if you want to have a debate about the average high school student, you want to be real about the interests of the average high school student. And all that basically means is once you figure out whatever the actor cares about, you then want to tie all of your impacts back to those interests. And I think you want to do that explicitly. Like, I do think it's useful to be like at the conclusion of every argument, judge, this actor wants this thing. Here's how we satisfy them or that interest for them under our side. I'm going to go through a few examples of this. I'm going to skip this example. Okay, never mind. I'll do this example very quickly. Let's say you have a motion like this house as environmentalists would embrace choice veganism, aka only sometimes being vegan. What do environmentalists want? Most people know that the environmental movement cares about external benefits, like people voting for them and passing legislation, but they also care about other things like principled consistency and being internally unified, or at least retaining people within their movement already. And that's where whenever you run arguments, you then want to sort of, be able to integrate in like, okay, here's an argument and here's what specific interest it relates to. And that can be helpful because it just makes it very clear why your argument fits in the debate. It's also helpful to prioritize. By prioritize, I mean explain which metric or which interest of an actor matters the most. As a quick note, especially to NYPDL debaters, this comes up a lot in NYPDL rounds. Even really good ones, cough, cough, Zach. Sorry, Zach, you're a great debater, but I've seen you do this. So sorry, I'm going to call you out publicly. It's not just you, though. I promise it's lots of people. I promise. I do this too, to be clear. There's like recorded rounds of me doing this. But people will do this thing where they'll be like, this house is a parent, and a parent cares about two things. They care about themselves, but they care most of all about their child. And that's great. But like sometimes teams don't rhetorically phrase this super well because they'll say like, parents care about these two things, and then they'll only like run arguments at like one of them or whatever. They'll be like, okay, parents care about their self-interest and the well-being of their children. And then they'll only run arguments about the well-being of their children. I'm kind of like, wait, but like, why did you tell me that self-interest matters so much? Like that seems kind of counterintuitive, kind of odd. And like, or they'll do the flip of it and they'll be like, parents really care mostly about the welfare of their children, but they care a tiny bit of their self-interest. And then they'll run like one argument on why this is good for your children and then spend just as much time in the argument on why this is good for yourself. Now, to be clear, I think that either of these strategies is fine. I just think you want to be rhetorically clear about what you're doing. So here's my advice. My advice is pick one, maybe two metrics that you think you're most likely to win the round on, and you can seriously convince a judge this actor cares the most about. Whenever you run arguments that don't fit into that metric, explicitly start that argument by saying, judge, to be clear, we don't think this is the priority in the debate. This argument is a contingency. It's like an insurance policy. Even if opposition could prove to you X argument is the most, or like X interest is most important, here's why we still win. So being rhetorically consistent on that, I think, is quite useful. So if you have a motion like this house is China would invest into Russia rather heavily, there's probably two things China wants: economic benefits, political benefits. There might be interesting framing you could maybe run, which is just looking at this motion intuitively, what clash do you think is easier for a gov team to lose on? Economic clash or political clash?
Economic.
Yeah, because it's going to be intuitively a bit harder to be the side defending investing into a kind of like pariah state that's heavily being sanctioned and its economy is very heavily doubted by the international community. Oops, I thought I added more to this slide. Oopsies. Like whatever. The point is, if you're gov, maybe you say something that's like, look, we think China's primary interests are political. Here's why this is in China's political interests. And here's why this is, but like, here's why China cares more about politics than it cares about economics. But I think that what you then want to also do is run another argument, which is, here's why this is economically good for China as well. Here is why this argument doesn't knife our first argument or our framing. It's just, even if all proves to you, especially in BP, a closing team proves to you that like the primary interest to be economic, here's why we still win. Okay, I have a few other examples, but I'm just going to skip past these because they're not as important. Two other quick comments on actor motions. First is dealing with moral arguments. These are tricky. And I'm going to be honest, I think that judges do have a tendency to adjudicate them inconsistently. But like when the motion is this house as a person, as a government, how do you evaluate moral claims? I think in most instances, you can actually run consequential versions of moral arguments. So for example, maybe you say something like, you have a moral duty to support your family or to support your friends. There's often a consequential version of that same argument, which is like, well, it doesn't really matter what like Kantian ethics says you should do, because helping your family and friends also ends up helping you. You feel good about it, they reciprocate the effort, yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. If you're ever in the position of being like, this team says you should do this thing because it's the moral duty. The very honest reality is that most actors in the world care about morality, but like, low-key do we? Look, guys, like, it's probably immoral for us to spend like 2 hours just like randomly learning about like random ass debate strategy instead of like, I don't know, like volunteering for Oxfam, but we all here. And that's like probably fine. It's probably not actually immoral. But like the point is, people are pretty comfortable in lots of instances with at least small scale moral violations. People obviously care about morality, but I think that in most instances, people are able to gaslight themselves into believing that what they're doing is moral. That's just a personal belief I have. Maybe it's wrong. But anyways, you can kind of beat moral arguments. Other thing, dealing with bad actors. There's this thing that a lot of teams will do. And don't get me wrong, when I was like, especially like a underclassmen debater, I did this as well, where like the motion will be like, this house is the United States, even as an example of maybe a somewhat bad actor. And teams will kind of squirm with this. They'll be like, well, the United States loves promoting democracy and we only do good things. Like, no, like, look, guys, if the motion says this house is a bad actor, you're going to be defending bad interests. It's unfortunate, and there's a separate debate about whether this is good or bad for the debate, but like it exists. So don't like shy away from it. Like, if you're gonna be this house is Russia, it's not as if Russia really cares about moral interests. If you have this house as the CCP would give universal suffrage to Hong Kong, and OP is like, or Gov is like, guys, there is a universal a priori right to democracy. Like, no, the CCP does not think there is a universal moral right to democracy. I'm not being like, what's the phrase? Flippant. It's just like they probably don't. So anyways, other thing is, the flip side of this is that oftentimes there are pragmatic versions of quote unquote good arguments. So what do I mean by that? It might be hard to convince China that there is a moral duty to give people in Hong Kong the right to universal suffrage, but there's a pragmatic case that's good for them. So you can often take, oh, this is the morally or the sort of good thing to do from an ethical perspective and reframe it as a pragmatic argument. Last thing I'll say quickly on bad actors is they're not always irrational. Classic example of this is North Korea. North Korea is probably not as crazily irrational as a lot of people like to portray them as. And like in a lot of instances, bad regimes are still very calculated in their badness. The fact that they're evil doesn't mean they're stupid. That's also true of a lot of debaters. Okay, any questions on those generic kind of types of motion type things before we talk about content? Let me quickly pause this so that I can actually see if anyone has thoughts. Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. Oops, wrong button. Okay, content. Next week, we're going to talk about specific strategies for like coming up with arguments and coming up with content. This week, I'm going to talk about a few different major types of motions and give some advice on them and talk about how to approach them. Also, FYI, this is probably going to take around 45 minutes. So we're probably going to finish about 10 or 15 minutes over technically like the quote unquote 9 o'clock deadline I set for myself. So I'm going into my grace period. I'm not sure why people say that. Sometimes they'll say like, I'm going into my grace period. I assume it's like a signaling judges thing, but I've always found it like, okay, thank you for telling me you're going into your grace period. My personal philosophy is if your name is Grace, you should get like an extra 30 seconds of grace time. Wouldn't that be funny? I think it'd be funny. Okay, we're going to talk about 6 different types of content emotions: stock motions, narrative motions, environment motions. I'm not going to spend a ton of time there because we're also going to talk about that in a few weeks. Sports, relationships, and religion. I flopped the order of relationships and religion. So I guess, yeah, something to be aware of. Stock motions, not about finance. Stock motions are basically motions that are really common or show up a lot. And stock arguments are arguments that show up a lot. A quick note, I think that some people use this phrase differently. This has always been my understanding of it. I think there might be different uses of this phrase in different circuits and different regions. But generally, when I say stock motions, I just mean like motions that maybe you've debated before or you're very familiar with, stuff like that. Counterintuitively, I think people actually do worse on stock motions than non-stock motions. And that's largely because I think that there's a tendency, to be clear, I want to be really clear. This happens to me a lot where I'll be like, OMG, I totally know what this clash is. We're going to rock it or whatever. And then you get kind of lazy in prep and you don't actually ask yourself the critical questions you need to ask. So 3 strategies for these. First, focus on weighing. If you know what the big arguments are and you know what the clash is going to be, spend some time in prep thinking about how you intend to weigh those arguments and beef up those parts of the argument. Like if you're going to weigh an argument heavily on certainty because you know that's going to be the round winning argument, don't like, it's like that like Mickey Mouse meme, like it's a surprise tool that will come in handy later. Don't do that. Like if you know that an argument's going to be winning, just weigh on it heavily to begin. Second, the fact that you've debated a topic before, the fact that you have run an argument before, doesn't mean it can't be run better and doesn't mean that you didn't miss arguments. So the other day, for example, I debated this house believes that it is immoral to have biological children. I've debated that motion like 3 times. And every time I've debated it, like I'm like, ooh, what else is there here? Because it's important to ask yourself what other things you might have otherwise missed or overlooked. Lastly, and this is my personal debate philosophy, so I will stand up and lecture you as if I'm really saying something powerful. Don't lose on the same topic twice if you can. I know it's not always in your control, but like whenever you debate a topic, think about that topic enough that you feel confident, like if you debate it again the next time, you're not going to lose on it. That's probably a good thing to do. Okay, we're going to do a little mini activity as a group because isn't that fun? Little group activity. So the way that we're going to basically do this is I'm going to give all of you guys a motion that is really, really stock. And I'm probably going to guess, I'm not going to say all of you have debated it, but you've definitely all thought about it for sure. I guarantee you. And I'm going to guess at least 60% of you have debated it. And what we're going to basically going to see is as a group, we're going to see how many arguments we can come up with in totality. And then we're going to talk a little bit about weaponizing them. So let's see if I can get this to work well. It's not going to be this house with banzoos. Sorry, Jared. Sorry. This house believes the rise of social media has done more harm than good. So here's what we're going to do, folks. Hang on. Let me open this document up. We're going to kind of like collectively, I'm going to take notes on this as arguments come in. So the topic that I want y'all's to be preppings is this house believes the rise of social media has done more harm than good. Okay, here's how we're going to do this. I'm going to do, Ryan. I'm going to give you guys 3. Oh, come on. I just want the Google timer. Oh, there we go. There it is. Okay, I'll reset it and then start it now. Okay, so you guys are going to have 3 minutes. I want y'all to think of as many gov arguments as you can. So you are opposite social media. So we're going to try to see how many arguments we can come up with, and then we're going to chat about them. So yeah, good luck. Have fun. I would sing the Jeopardy theme song right now, but that feels like it would not help. Dang, prep feels long when you're not prepping. I kind of forgot about that. One day, I'm going to make someone, if they ever tell me that 15 minutes is not enough time to prep, I'm going to try to make them plank for 15 minutes. Not really, but like definitely at least 2 minutes, and then see if they're still laughing. What do you call a snarky criminal walking down a flight of stairs? A condescending condescending. Does anyone here like baseball? I don't like baseball, but I heard a funny joke the other day about baseball. Is anyone here like an MLB fan? What's a Pirate's favorite letter, Sophie? A letter from their general manager saying they got traded to the Mets. Ha 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 ha. Because everyone thinks it's R, but actually it's not. I thought that was funny.
I will have you know, Ryan, I have 2 friends who can plank for 8 minutes at a time.
Is one of them named Ann Walsh Henderson?
No, one of them is also named Ryan.
That's impressive. That's not me, to be clear. I can plank for, I would say, definitely 2 minutes. I did last summer or 2 summers ago. I did like that 5-minute plank challenge, and I did it. I plank I don't know, I'm not. I don't know. I guess I should see. I don't know. It's wacky. Okay, you guys have 10 seconds left. Do 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 do. All right. Okay. Let's see how many we can come up with. Okay. So this is a stock motion. You've probably thought about it a lot. And trust me, there's a lot of content here. Okay, I'm just gonna ask that people, I know that the chat exists, and I know that it's oh, I don't want to have my voice be spoken, but if you can just unmute, please, that would make my day so peachy. If you could just shout arguments out. So arguments, social media is bad. Boo, social media. Screw you, Mark Zuckerberg.
Mental health.
Okay, tell me more. Why is it bad for mental health?
Basically, social media sets unrealistic standards, and when people see those standards, they feel like they have to meet up to them, but oftentimes they don't. So they feel
Wonderful.
bad about themselves.
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Okay, hang on, I need to look at chat. Okay, let's see. Okay, we'll go Jeffrey and then Ming.
There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation.
Okay, cool. Ming.
Along that vein, there's a lot of polarizations through echo chambers made by algorithms and also demonizing other side.
Yeah, for sure. Isha.
I think you can always pull the cyberbullying and hate speech as well.
Yeah, I'll put cyberbullying under mental health, and I'll put oops, I forgot that I can't copy and paste without messing up Google Docs. And I'll put hate speech.
Go in that vein, you can talk about the fact that social media allows for anonymity, which is a specific thing that it does to increase hate speech and bullying.
Yeah, for sure. Inusha, sorry if I mispronounced that. Feel free to correct me.
No, you're good. So the safety of children, basically creepy people. I don't know how to word it.
Yeah, for sure. Jared.
All right, this is gonna be sort of a weird one, but it's because I've been reading Brave New World and stuff like that. So,
great book. I love that.
It lowers attention span, and also due to the fact that it favors sensationalism and entertainment, or stamps down on art in favor of things that'll just keep you entertained. It reduces critical thought, which can contribute to more corporate control and less public interest in democracy.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, we'll whip through a few more. Okay, let's go. Okay, we'll go Dan, Caden, and then Andrew.
It's immoral because it promotes people just wasting time on the internet while other people are suffering.
I use OC for opportunity cost for sure. Who did I say next? Caden, I think.
Yeah, it decreases face-to-face interaction, which would make individuals worse when it comes to in-person social situations.
Yeah, Andrew, then Julia.
Decentralizes information, so people don't have a common understanding of the world.
Yeah, Julia.
It gives a lot of social control to corporations.
Awesome. Okay. Emily?
How it's also bad for the physical health of people. So things like wacky sleep schedules, a lack of exercise. So it's probably a bit tied to opportunity cost and mental health as well.
Yeah, for sure. Anusha, is your hand up from before a new argument?
Oh, I forgot to lower it.
All good. Okay, cool. So guys, in 3 minutes of prep, we collectively came up with probably 13, 14-ish arguments, if you were to piece these things together, right? So the point is, if you got this motion at a competition, you would be in a really, really good place to argue it, right? But counterintuitively, having this much material makes things difficult, right? Because, it's going to be hard to figure out, A, what content do you prioritize, but also B, how do you employ those arguments in the debate? Next week, I'm going to talk a lot more about how you construct arguments in a way that I think is more likely than not to be good for you in the debate, but kind of big picture, all of the things I kind of talked about earlier about things well, even after 3 minutes of prep, continuing to think, like, there's some really interesting ideas that you guys mentioned that we could explore a lot more. Like, how does this affect corporate influence over democracy? How does this affect different types of countries? So thinking about Arab Spring, thinking about developing countries, thinking about authoritarian countries, a lot of stuff like that. Like, you can kind of think of a whole bunch of things that, you know, maybe you didn't think of in the first 3 minutes, but still have the potential to be around winning, right? So like thinking about other arguments, but also figuring out taking, if we take these, how many do we say? What, like, oh, oops, wrong document. If we take this, right, I mean, if we have technically 11 taglines, but probably 13 or 14 actual arguments here, like you can take these arguments and you can package them in different ways that make them more or less likely to be perceived well by a judge. So like weighing different arguments in different ways, right? Like we know empirically that like mental health suffers because of social media. So weighing that argument on certain metrics, like this affects very vulnerable or impressionable younger generations. This is a very certain and very likely impact to manifest, yada, yada, is a good way of taking emotion where the problem you're going to face is not coming up with too little content, it's coming up with too much, and figuring out how to package that material in the kind of best way possible.
I have a question.
Yes.
So in regards to that, in terms of all of the stuff that we came up with, I think there's a lot of good stuff there. And like what you were just saying about, you know, prioritizing the stuff that has like huge impacts, like you were just talking about with the mental health. But is there some merit to, if you have this much content, like at least having one argument that maybe is less often run, so it's less likely that op would already know a response to it?
Yeah, so I think that for sure works. I do think that you want to run all of the really good stuff. Like I think that a gov team that doesn't talk about mental health is like questionable, right? Yeah. But like, for example, let's say that, for instance, you're deciding between like, do we want to run an argument about like the specific mechanism through which social media worsens hate speech? Or do we want to run maybe a little bit less stock of an argument on like, for instance, why corporate control over political discourse is worsened as a consequence of social media? Maybe you err towards the latter, although I will say that I think on stock motions, the biggest thing I'd say is make sure you cover all of the really obvious stuff. Again, this is an unfortunate thing, but like even the best judges like kind of have something of a familiarity bias. Like if I'm judging a team on this motion, like I'm going to be honest, if they don't run mental health, I'm going to spend a decent bit of PMC scratching my head. Like, bruh, what are you doing? So like running the important / obvious stuff is good. Other thing I'd say though is like, you know, in general, you can also plan deliberately to run stuff out of a second speech. Like for example, you can do this thing, which is like, oh, maybe for example, like you saved this argument as a response to a potential op rebuttal. Or maybe you, for example, run one mechanism, like this mechanism, on corporate control, and then you save a different one, like the social influence that corporations have because of mass followings, et cetera, on Instagram for the second speech. And you can kind of divvy up content kind of like that. Anyways, good job, folks. Very nice job with that activity. Okay, quick thing. Americans, if you need to take a drink of water, go take a drink of water, because Canadians, we're going to chat about you for a second. Stock motions in BP are both really good and really bad for closing teams, in my opinion. The really good thing is that most stock motions, I would say, tend to be a little bit on the deeper side. So stock motions often became stock because of the fact that they are so like relatively good motions to debate. So like this house would legalize all drugs, kind of stock at this point, but it's honestly pretty deep, at least on Gov. This house would privatize state-owned enterprises in the developing world. Very stock motion, at least at the university level, but also really deep. If you're on closing on a stock motion, it can be a little bit worrisome because opening will generally tend to run all the obvious stuff. There's two things that I think actually help this. The first is, you know what opening is probably going to run. If you're on this house and legalize all drugs as CG, you know what opening government's going to run, assuming you're in a reasonably good room. They're going to run something on the principle of agency. They're going to run something about pragmatic benefits of safer drugs. If they're smart, maybe they'll run stuff on other impacts this has vis-a-vis rehabilitation. But that also means that you can figure out how you're going to weigh out that material. And so it can be very useful as a closing team to think about what, and this doesn't just apply to the team vertically above you, but also the team diagonal from you. You can think a decent bit more in prep about, okay, we probably know what opening is going to run to a pretty large extent. It's not just like, oh, let's run other stuff or prep other stuff. It's also, how do we weigh against that? The second thing, obviously, is that as a team closing off of a stock motion, it can be pretty helpful to then prioritize prep time towards other issues. So if you're CG on this house would legalize all drugs, for instance, like if you spend a lot of time chatting about like, oh, we get safer drugs under our side, it's probably a waste of time because like unless your OG is really, really new, they're going to know the argument and they've heard it and they've probably run it before. If you're closing government on this house would privatize state-owned enterprises, or sorry, nationalize state-owned enterprises where they're currently privately run, like if you're CG, you know opening government's going to run arguments about why private sector incentives are bad and you get price gouging. So don't spend a bunch of time dealing with the really trivial stuff, focus elsewhere. Again, this is true for any BP prep on closing, but it's especially true on stock motions. Other thing that you can deal with if you're really stuck, think about the stock material that the diagonal team from you will run, like opening up if you're closing gov, and figure out how you're going to deal with it. That's going to be helpful. Okay, we're going to blitz through in like 20 minutes, 5 types of motions. So buckle up, folks. We're going to have fun. Narrative motions. I'm going to go fast through this. There's much more comprehensive document I put in chat. Hang on. I'll put it in chat again. Oh no, I don't have the link anymore. Someone, I don't know. I'll send it in the email out later anyway, so you'll find it. Narrative motions. Most important thing I want to flag, narrative motions are not motions about the, at least generally, about the underlying truth of some narrative. This house regrets the narrative that patience is a virtue. Is not really a debate about whether patience is a virtue. It's a debate about whether it is good or bad to view patience as a virtue. In terms of how you prep narrative motions, there's a few steps I think are important. I'll talk about all of these. The first thing, anytime you see THR, this house regrets, ding, 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 counterfactual, you also want to think about who's actually affected by a narrative. So who does this narrative apply to? Who is receptive to this narrative? And then you want to, I think, divvy up arguments into 2 broad clusters, whatever you want to call them. The word clumps sounds so jarring to me. Clumps? Like, ugh, like it just sounds ugly. Cluster is a nice word though. Micro and macro. Micro is how does a narrative affect individual people? This house regrets the glorification of hard work. What effect does this have on an individual person? You're a grad student, you're a 9-to-5 job worker, you're working in a factory. What does this narrative do to affect you? 2 groups of people to think about there. First, what happens to people who comply with the narrative, comply with the norm, or comply with some sort of societally held belief? And what happens to people who diverge from that norm? So if society says you should forgive other people, what happens when you don't forgive other people? You can also think about macro scale impacts. How does society respond to narratives? And also, more importantly, how can society or specific groups within society, like activists, spin narratives in a way that's rhetorically powerful in terms of pushing for socially utile change? So there's a few stock types of arguments that come up a lot. I'm going to quickly chat about them. First, very common argument you'll hear in narrative motions is about coercion. The easiest way to beat coercion arguments on narrative motions is just to say that there is a counterfactual narrative which is also coercive, or just to say that we think coercion is less important than getting socially utile outcomes. We, to some extent, coerce people all the time, and we often are fine with that as long as it results in good outcomes for people. And you can often make arguments that say society should pressure people to do the better thing for them. People don't always naturally make good decisions, especially in very emotionally charged moments in their life, for example. So if you have emotion like this house regrets the romanticization of motherhood, gov teams might run arguments about coercion. Maybe op says, look, this is still going to be coercive on either side. There is other exogenous pressures that pressure women to have children, to become mothers, etc. The second common type of argument that comes up in narrative motions, and in my opinion, I think like the least commonly run, but often the most useful, is how do narratives get spun, especially by activists, but not necessarily always by good actors. So like, how do, for example, abusive or toxic friends or romantic partners spin narratives? Or how can narratives be rhetorically weaponized by politicians, by corporations, stuff like that? So for example, I think a really common but good op on this house regrets the notion that people should do what they love is just to say, look, we agree that maybe it's not always great for people to quote unquote do what they love. But if a person has a desperately intense passion for art, this narrative might not be the thing that causes them to pursue a career in art. They're going to pursue a career in art either way. This narrative is what is then used by people, for example, within the industry to push for things like better scholarship opportunities, to push for things like mentorship programs, because you can say things like, look, we want people to do what they love, and we need to provide them the support structures necessary to do that. That argument has nothing to do with the truth of the narrative, and it has nothing to do with the micro scale impacts of the narrative. It in fact washes out the micro scale impacts. It just has to do with what are the macro scale impacts that come from weaponizing this narrative in rhetorical ways. Third common argument you'll hear: what happens when people will do something anyways? I think that people have a tendency to, I'm not sure why I keep saying that so much tonight. I'm not blaming you. I'm just saying opinions that I have. of which I have many. A lot of them are really bad. Some of them are really funny, and some of them are really good. That's a small minority, admittedly. But in a lot of instances, like there's kind of, and I do this a lot too. I'm guilty of this as well, where like you'll see a motion that's like, this house regrets X, or like this house regrets the narrative that X is good or whatever. And everyone in the debate will be like, it's really bad when people do X, or it's really good when people do X. This is a great example of it, right? A bunch of people in this motion will just make arguments about why people pursuing like art degrees is good or bad or whatever. But like in a lot of instances, like people are not like mindless zombie robots. Like they'll make decisions due to more proximate reasons, like their own immediate economic or social or cultural desires. At that point in time, there's two camps of people. People who do what a narrative tells you to do. So for example, if you have a narrative like this house supports the idea that patience is a virtue, some people will be patient, some people will not be patient. The question is, what happens when someone complies with the narrative? What happens when someone doesn't? You can often make arguments about why, if someone will do something anyways, like for example, work hard, if we glorify that thing, it's good. So if you have this house regrets the glorification of hard work, common op argument will be like, look, the reason that most people work hard ain't because a narrative tells them to, it's because they like have to, otherwise they're gonna low-key starve. We might as well glorify the act of working hard. So I guess I just gave that example there, but yeah, anyways. Fourth thing you'll hear a decent bit is like, what happens when people defy norms, which is kind of the inverse of what I was just chatting about. So if you have a narrative like saying that going to university is really important, you might make arguments about why not everyone will go to university. What happens when people don't go to university, how they get stigmatized, how they get blamed, yada, yada, yada. This is my attempt at rewriting the lyrics from Defying Gravity from Wicked. It's a really good musical. Y'all should see it. It's very fun. I'm a big fan. Anyways, the kind of big conclusion is talk about the implications of narratives as opposed to the underlying truth. This motion is a good example where that's not universally true. Like this is a debate where you're going to want to ask a question that's like, yo, is it really true that going to university is necessary? But outside of that, talking about consequential implications matters more. Questions about narrative motions. Okay, just for the sake of time, because we're going to run a little bit late, I'm just going to get going. And then if someone has questions, you can feel free to ask me. Environment, we're going to go fast with this one because I was midway through writing this section of the presentation when I realized that we're going to cover this in like 3 weeks. So yeah. 3 types of environmental debates you have. Principle versus environment. So things like transferring control of environmentally significant areas to a global body, things like deciding environmental policy through technocratic as opposed to democratic bodies. There's often motions comparing economic harms to environmental harms. That's things like, for example, having carbon taxes and stuff like that. And you also, of course, tend to have debates about differing strategies for benefiting the environment and which of those strategies happens to be best. So, for example, what agenda should an environmental movement pursue? What type of environmental regulation is most effective? What sort of strategy should activists take when pushing for environmental reform? There's a couple of common arguments I think you want to be thinking about. And again, I'll talk about these more extensively in the future. I think that whenever you're talking about benefiting the environment, there's a few levels at which it happens. How do you change the behaviors of corporations? How do you change the behaviors of governments? How do you change the behavior of individuals? How do you change the behavior of sort of technology, especially in terms of things like green tech, et cetera? Oftentimes, these are interconnected. So for example, if every single consumer tomorrow stopped using gas, that would also change the behavior of corporations. If tomorrow a government implemented regulations on corporations, that would hint change the incentives or the actions of corporations. So think about how environmental motions impact these 4 levels, and you can often make arguments about why one group is more important. So for example, you might say changing corporate behavior equals more important than changing individual behavior because individuals contribute far less to climate change than like the 70 biggest corporations or whatever. Maybe you say it's more important to change governments than corporations because it's going to be really hard to change corporations on their own because they always care about profit and tend to be somewhat short term, but governments are the ones that have the capacity to regulate corporations, et cetera. There's a couple of specific mechanisms that come up a decent bit that can be useful. Thinking about how do you make governments care enough about the long-term consequences of climate change is often helpful. Thinking about how do you make renewable energy more economically affordable, not just to regular people, but also to governments, to corporations, to profit-conscious corporations in particular. And also importantly, how do you make the environment enough of a voting issue, or even if not a voting issue, something that people do care politically about? There are lots of people in the world who care about climate change. They will never vote on it as a #1 priority because they'll always care more about the candidate who is better economically for them, better educationally for their children. And so you can often make arguments about how you change the incentives of voters, which is kind of a subset of individuals. A couple of notes on weighing environment stuff. This is all self-explanatory, but basically, if you're ever weighing arguments about climate change, it's pretty easy to weigh those. It is the most irreversible debate you can basically ever have. It probably has the highest scale magnitude of any impact you could ever come up with in debate outside of maybe nuclear war. And there's also lots of other things that you can run for why the environment is the most important issue in any debate. The fact it's long-term, the fact it harms animals who have moral rights, the fact that it hurts the least well off the most. The cruel irony of climate change is that the countries that have done the least to cause it suffer the most. Interestingly, you can also run arguments against like weighing the environment as a #1 priority. The biggest argument I'll kind of flag here is this one. So oftentimes you can make a kind of interesting argument, which is if you have debates that kind of involve environmental benefits trading off with economic costs, there's kind of a funky argument you can run. Like, and to be clear, I think it's independently very difficult to really weigh a economic harm argument as being more important than the environment, but you can often frame economic arguments as kind of being logically prior to environmental arguments. One of those examples would be saying something like this. Look, in order to get the political capital for lots of other policies like government subsidies for green tech, you need people to feel economically okay enough about their current position in life that they're willing to do things like have taxpayer dollars fund green tech initiatives. And if people do not feel economically stable enough to do that, like, for example, arguably right now in an era of very high inflation, even if Gov gets one environmental policy passed, it's never enough to create the really radical technological change necessary to do a lot of good things for the climate. It's kind of an interesting way of like running economic arguments as being more significant. You can also say that there's an opportunity cost. Like if we implement this environmental policy, it often just comes at the expense of some other environmental policy. This is a debate lie, but it also sounds persuasive. So you can run it if you want. The riskiest argument is to be like, well, we're screwed anyways. So do we care about the climate? This is risky, and I would advise you not to run it. Unless you like really want to like nuke the whole debate, which is probably not a good idea. But also having fun is fun. So anyways, last thing, principles versus environment stuff. This is kind of like the examples of like, do you, for example, delegate control of environmental policy to technocrats as opposed to really shitty democratic politicians? In most instances, this is not all that different from any other democracy versus technocracy type debate, by which I mean one side is like, we get better outcomes, and one side is like, well, do you? And also maybe this isn't democratic. You can always run arguments against like technocratic control. When I say technocrat, I just mean like experts. The common argument is like environmental racism. A lot of the people who spend a lot of time studying climate change have really good intentions. They're often quite privileged though, and that means they often do implement bad policies, a la infringing on the rights of indigenous communities, doing things that are harmful for racial minorities, etc. And you can at least try to run mitigation as to why democratically elected politicians have better incentives. There's like a kind of something of a green revolution. A lot of younger voters are becoming increasingly more politically active. There's a rising environmental movement, blah, blah, blah. In terms of weighing against democracy, you can run all of the stock democracy doesn't matter that much arguments. You can say things like, look, we have central banks. They're not really democratic, but we're fine with that because it gets us better outcomes. Maybe we should do the same thing vis-a-vis climate change. You can also just say other things like, look, if people die because of climate change, we should probably weigh people's right to not die because of higher sea levels as being more important than something like democracy. Environment. We're all screwed, but not in debate because y'all are really smart and cool people. Any questions on that stuff that folks want to ask? And the cool news is, if in case you have questions, you can also ask them next time we chat about the environment, which will be in like 3 weeks or something like that. I kind of forget low-key. Okay, quick meme break. I thought this was a funny meme. You can all take a second to enjoy it. Get it? Haha. Wow, no reaction. I thought it was pretty good. I thought that was a pretty fun meme. You know, it was good.
I realized this might. I've been hearing this joke for my entire life.
Oh no, I did not make this joke. To be clear, this is not my joke. This is not my joke. I think it's funny though. I just saw it this afternoon on a meme page, and I was like, whoa, that's kind of low-key funny. Thank you, Julia and Caden. Wow, the Westfield kids coming to my back. Okay, sports motions. I came up with this meme the other day. I'm so proud of it. Get it? Didn't Tom Brady didn't he deflate footballs or something, I think? Did he inflate them or deflate them? It was Deflategate, right? Not Inflategate. That's what Biden's doing right now. Okay, 3 types of sports motions: social justice / sports motions, sports / sports motions, and politics / economics / sports motions. Oh my gosh, I actually put the Mets joke in there, Sophie. That's kind of funny. Okay, first, arguing about sports. Let's cover some basic sports. Basketball, where you huck a little orange thing into a hoop. Football, where you actually bash your head out because you're trying to like keep the ball away from other people. Debate is not actually a sport, but we all tell ourselves it's a sport. Ha ha ha. Okay, quick thing. A lot of debaters are not sports people, and that's fine. I'm not a huge sports person either. But the gist is you want to at least have some vague familiarity with why sports are such a big thing and why people care about them. Why do players like sports? It's fun. There's opportunities for careers, teamwork, blah, blah, blah. And a lot of people just like look here, like sports are like a cool way to escape from like the normal mundanity of life. Same thing for viewers. You are able to create communities, you're able to find friends, there's a mechanism of escapism, and often sports are a very culturally valued thing. Like people just like go out and watch the local high school football team get absolutely annihilated, which was the case for my high school. I once, because I was in the band and we played the pit orchestra, whatever, no, not pit orchestra, but what's it called? What's the side band called? Not the
Pep band.
Pep band, thank you, Caden. And like we watched our team get destroyed, but there was this fun rule that said that if you got really destroyed, then you could leave the game early. So we always rooted against our team. There's also other actors that care about sports. The media cares about sports because they make the ka-ching, ka-ching, and sports leagues obviously care about sports because the name sports is in sports leagues. Duh, they care. That being said, there's a few barriers to sports that are often debated. Things like ticket prices, things like to what extent do communities feel represented by their local sporting clubs? To what extent do you have like racist, rich, white assholes who own and run sports teams? And to what extent do they do that in good / bad ways? Yes, that's true, Caden. My high school team was very bad, but that's okay because woohoo, we love you, Conard High School. Anyways, in terms of athletes though, this is where there are larger barriers to entry, especially for poorer athletes. Things like, do you have access to good coaches, to stadiums, to equipment, to training programs, to mentorship opportunities? But it's also a question of emotional comfort. It's often very helpful, especially when you're debating college level or high school level athletics, to point out that people do need to feel, at least to some extent, emotionally safe on teams to engage with them. You need to have things like strong bond. Well, okay, you don't have to have strong bonds on your team. Like, I mean, like, I don't know. James Harden plays basketball. I don't know if anyone gets like along with him or Kyrie Irving, but they're like, whoa, they're on the same team. There's no way that works, right? Anyways, someone who actually knows basketball can answer that. But the point is like, you probably do need to have some degree of like camaraderie between your team to feel like, like you're actually doing well and like you feel like you can trust other team players and stuff like that. The other thing quickly I'll flag is that different sports debates happen at different levels. So remember, for example, that like most high school athletes don't play in college. Most college athletes don't play professionally. And most professional athletes don't play in heaven, if heaven does, as a matter of fact, exist. As a matter of fact, actually, I don't know if that's true because I haven't been to heaven, but this is basically heaven for all of you. Debate on a Wednesday night. Other common debate is commercialization. So commercialization is when you have like, companies and like rich people who are like, wow, sports are fun, but they're also really great opportunities for making money. Classic arguments for why commercial ownership is good. It gives teams more money. Owners tend to be relatively long-termist in terms of wanting to grow the value of a team. They're also more easily canceled and hold to account compared to a mass of fans. The benefit of having a community, like for example, the Green Bay Packers being owned by Green Bay, is that you arguably fulfill the principal duty of sports teams to kind of be represented and run by their communities. And there's also lots of pragmatic arguments you can make about the benefits of local communities owning sports teams, like the fact that people care more about sports compared to like rich dudes in like suits and ties 500 miles away just running a team because they want to make a like quick buck off it, whatever that happens to be. Second type of sports debates, social justice. The kind of issues internally within sports tend to be things like unequal funding, racism, discrimination. There's also a lot of health concerns, but much like on a lot of other things, Americans are like really bad at this because like American football is horrible. I mean, like, guys, have you ever watched American football? I only ever watched the Super Bowl. All I know about the Super Bowl is that the halftime show always is really boring. Half of the commercials are really annoying. The QR code that bounced around the screen this past year, I found really irritating. And also they like all destroy their heads. I think that's how football works. Quick side note. I know I said I was going to be fast. If any of y'all ever have children, okay, here's what you do. You raise your child from a young age. You develop one leg on your child that is freakishly strong. Only one leg. Like you like get like their like right leg, like mega bulked up, and you get them to be really freaking good at punting. Okay. And then they become an NFL punter. They'll make a few $1 million. They'll never get hit. probably, and they'll definitely not probably get concussed. And you'll like retire happily because your kid will support you in old age. So do that. Anyways, in all seriousness, like funding opportunities in general, money gets you lots of things in sports, coaching, equipment, training, blah, 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 lots of cool things. Racism, a really big issue in sports, counterintuitively, is that even though a lot of sporting leagues are very racially and ethnically diverse, coaching staffs and management are often not. So for example, there are 32 NFL teams. I think currently 5 of them, but in the past I think it was like only like, there was a period of time where it was only 1. There's for the most of last season was 3 black coaches. There are, of all the players in the NFL, 58% of them are black. The fact that 9-ish% of NFL coaches are black is horrible. And it's not just that like, oh, it's bad to have white coaches. It's also that there's a lot of bias within coaching. So especially when it comes to things like what players do you recruit? What players do you draft? What players do you give opportunities to? It's often based on very intangible things like, is this player coachable? And that's often where there's the capacity for bias to enter into decision making, like, do I give you time on the field? Do I not, et cetera. It's often the case that fans can be racist. So like, for example, sports are probably one of the only social situations in which it's genuinely allowed to like actually just like, you know, scream at people and like loudly say like F you, and like everyone like cheers you on. And that does often give rise to very toxic attitudes towards racial minorities. This is a good quote. It's from a movie. It's a movie about NFL concussions, but it's true. The NFL is the National Football League. They're the one where all the players bash their heads. Not good. Also, the flip side of social justice in sports is that sports does often act as something of a mechanism for social change. The reason for this a lot of the time is that you have very powerful icons, people like LeBron James, Serena Williams, but also lots of other individuals, even if they're not massively accomplished within the sports league. And they often develop things like cults of personality. They're given tons of time in the media. And that often means that children look up to them. It means they have lots of media coverage. And that often means that sports players can act as kind of vehicles and vectors for change. There's often, especially in the more modern era, an increasing level of scrutiny on sports leagues. So Brian Flores, for example, is the former coach of the Miami Dolphins, right? I think Miami. He launched a lawsuit against the NFL for racism. Y'all got to read about it. It's horrible. But there's this one really funny part, which is basically the gist of how Flores knew he was being discriminated against is before he had even interviewed for a head coaching position, because there's this thing called the Rooney Rule that requires NFL teams to at least interview 2 people of color or women for coaching positions. And he like got a text from Bill Belichick, who's like basically the god of football, but maybe not, because maybe that's Tom Brady, but I'm not going to get into that debate because someone will kill me for sure. And basically he got a text from Bill Belichick who was like, congratulations, you got the job. He's like, oh my gosh, I haven't interviewed yet. That's weird. And Bill actually meant to text a different dude named Brian. And then Brian was like, see, this proves that the NFL is racist, which it is. That was a bad retelling. Also, a bunch of really racist team names have been changed, which is a fantastic thing. The kind of common reason why sports are not a universally effective mechanism for change is like commercial incentives exist. Michael Jordan was very famous. He was a great NBA basketball player, arguably the first or second best basketball player. I'm sorry if there are any Laker fans here. But he had this like famous line, which is like, Republicans buy sneakers too. And the risk of being political is that you alienate some people who otherwise like watch your games, buy your shit, stuff like that. Politics and economics. Okay, I'm going to skip this slide for a second. I'm just going to predict to you that you're going to get a debate at some point next fall about the LIV Golf League. It's a golf league that's really controversial right now. It's backed by Saudi Arabia. I also think you're going to get debates about Qatar, which is currently hosting this year's World Cup and has had a huge number of human rights atrocities associated with it. A few common kind of political/economic things that come up in debate. I'll skip nationalism, but economically, there's lots of reasons why having a sports team can be good for you. Things like stadiums can increase tourism. You get things like local businesses being set up. People come to watch your team, blah, blah, blah. There's also economic costs of especially professional sports teams. So for example, every single year in the United States alone, $2.5-ish roughly billion are given in direct subsidies to sports stadiums per year. And there's something like $150-ish million worth of tax breaks that are given in like one state alone to sports stadiums. And it's often because teams will like go to their like local town and they'll be like, hi, hon, you love having us here, right? Yeah, it would be really sad if we left. And then they can threaten to leave, much like any business can. And cities have to give in by giving them things like subsidies, etc. You can also talk about the impact that sports have on things like culture, society, politics, and stuff like that, especially in an era where a lot of sports figures have become increasingly outspoken on political issues, yada, yada, yada. Sports washing is also becoming an increasingly hot topic on the university circuit. I'm sure it'll trickle down to high school at some point. But basically, like, a lot of countries that do really bad things will basically use sports to kind of low-key cover up for it. Saudi Arabia, they bought out Newcastle United, for example, which is I think it's an English football team, which is American soccer, but whatever. And they also recently funded this massive golf league, which is competing with the PGA or whatever the hell it's called. Other instances of this, very famously, like the 1936 Berlin Olympics, is commonly seen as a very famous example of a bad country using the Olympics as a way of trying to improve their international image. There's also other examples of this. There was this Italian politician who was like a PM for the country forever, but he was like mega corrupt, but arguably he was partially really well loved because he also owned a very successful football club. The other common debate that comes up is like Olympics things. I linked in the document a bunch of things on why the Olympics are good/bad, so consult that. Okay, any questions on sports motions? Sorry, we're going over. I scheduled time poorly. I'll wrap it up by 9:30 and then we'll do Kahoot, and then I'll get you all to bed by 10 with a glass of warm milk and a cookie. I lied about the cookie part. I would take the cookie for myself. Sorry. Religion. Religion is tricky because there's lots of different types of religion motions, and they tend to be very different, and they tend to be a bit motion specific. There's kind of two big common issues, though, that relate a lot of religion motions. Number one is like, how do we make religions better? So there are lots of motions you might debate that are like, this house prefers this type of religion to that type of religion, or this house believes that religions should stop doing this thing, or this house thinks that religion does this thing well or this thing poorly. In those contexts, there's often two-ish, arguably, major things that come up a lot. The first is, how do you make religion more progressive, or at least less hating of people who don't do things that like Jesus or whoever said they didn't like? Oftentimes, there are a few reasons why religions tend to be relatively regressive. They tend to be quite old, and they often tend to be governed by people who are old. You can change religion in a few different ways. There is arguably a general incentive for religion just to retain members by becoming more progressive. That's why you've seen, for example, like the Mormon Church, for instance, has a lot of problems, don't get me wrong, but used to be like very explicitly racist against African Americans, realized that its membership was vastly falling off because of that, changed it, and its membership almost doubled. So there's arguably something of an incentive for religions to naturally tend towards progressivism as liberalization and secularization increases. You can also try to progressively reinterpret religions. So things like, for example, Islamic feminism use Islamic scripture to substantiate feminist arguments. A very compelling argument you can give in debate rounds for why this is important is that if you're a really devout religious person, you almost always will place greater credence on religious conceptions of the truth over secular conceptions of the truth, which means a feminist coming into your town square and saying a bunch of secular humanistic arguments about feminism doesn't do much to persuade you, but saying, here is why your God or your religious scripture supports this interpretation of the world, that's very persuasive. The other thing that is commonly debated in religion rounds is like, how do you make religion less coercive, i.e., how do you make religion stop bossing people around so much? And also, how do you make religion less hard to leave? Oftentimes, this is harder to prove and harder to get. But in general, if you can make it easier for people to get support outside of religion, and if you can make it easier for people to feel emotionally comfortable leaving religion, that decreases the degree to which religions are coercive over their members. The other thing that comes up in a lot of debates is like, is religion good or bad? I'm not going to spend time on this. There's a bunch of stuff I put in the document that you can read through in case you're curious about kind of some of the common good arguments about why religion is good or why religion is bad. Other thing is that there's obviously a lot of intersection between religious arguments and political arguments, economic arguments, blah, blah, blah. Different countries approach the issue of state versus church divide differently. So France is a very extreme example. France has what's known as laïcité, which basically is a very intense iteration of secularism, where you basically fully separate the realm of state from the realm of church. Other countries have perhaps explicit bans on things like the infiltration of religion into the state, but still have some degree of encroachment on each. You should all also watch Boso's speech on that, whatever Yale round, where he talks about religion, because everyone loves that speech. Religion obviously also has a large impact on culture. I won't spend a ton of time on that. I think that's relatively self-explanatory. More stuff again in the document. Okay, I blitzed through like a bazillion things about religion and debate, and a lot of it was quite intense. Do folks have questions they want to ask, or are people just here because they want to get the prize for the Kahoot? Both are fair. Okay, last thing, relationships. This is very quick because I don't have a lot to say here. There's two types of like clashes that come up in like relationships debates. There's micro clashes. These are like really, I can't give super generic advice. Like this house would date this person, or like this house would prefer to be in this type of relationship. There's much better debates on macro scale stuff, like how do we conceptualize of romance, like, or like interpersonal relationships in general? What norms exist around that and stuff like that? If you ever have micro scale debate, I'm gonna be fully honest, like these are just very, very motion dependent. Like, I don't know, like whatever. It's kind of weird. This is a preview of the economics debate. It's going to be kind of fun. So, you know, come to the economics presentation. I can't hype it up enough. I really think it's going to be fun. I've spent so much time getting very excited for economics. Get it? The fault in our stars become swap. Okay, anyways. Basically, if you have like a this house would debate this person thing, whatever, just it's motion dependent. Do all the things I talked about before and next week. The better types of romance / interpersonal relationships debates are about macro scale things like social norms around romance, the general way that society perceives of interpersonal relationships, stuff like that. There's, I think, a few different things that you want to think about and brainstorm on these motions: abusive relationships, healthy relationships, and relationships that don't fit into conventional or traditionalistic views of romance or relationships in general. In terms of abusive relationships, the one like big thing that I just like really want to emphasize, and this isn't a debate thing, this is a human moral, being a good human being thing. Don't ever say the thing which is like, well, like if you're in an abusive relationship, just leave. It's really like, it's a bad argument. And basically the reason why is that in lots of instances, really abusive people will not make you realize that you're being abused. And if anything, they'll actually make you feel like you are the abuser because they'll gaslight you in a very harmful and bad way. And oftentimes you can make arguments in narrative debates even about how certain narratives, especially around things like forgiveness, can often be manipulated by abusers in relationships in very bad ways. It's also the case, though, that people are often stuck and trapped in abusive relationships. So it's often the case that you're, for example, financially dependent on a spouse, you're not able to leave, yada, yada, yada. So oftentimes you can weigh this group very heavily in making arguments about the impacts on very vulnerable groups, i.e. abused people within relationships. And you can talk about why narratives or kind of ways of restructuring relationships can make abusive relationships better. This is a very easy group to weigh on, especially given that they are honestly not that small of a group and very vulnerable. And it's often the case that abusive relationships are compounded by other axes of oppression. So for example, women are asymmetrically, in at least lots of instances, the victims of abuse. And therefore you kind of compound the generic harms of abuse in relationships with other forms of patriarchy, sexism, etc. You obviously also, though, can make arguments about healthier relationships. And in most instances, the types of arguments you make about those relationships are like, how do you make communication feel more comfortable? How do you deepen the bonds that you have between different people? So even if you, for example, just have a motion like this house prefers a world where children are raised communally, you can make arguments about on what side you get better relationships between children and parents, on what side do children feel more trusting of their parents, on what side are you better able to ensure that children confide in their parents. You can make all of those sorts of arguments and create mechanisms that link into things like trust, fidelity, the depth of the relationship you enjoy, etc. Lastly, think about the impacts on people who otherwise don't fit into very conventional views of relationships and interpersonal connections. The LGBTQ community, individuals who might not, for example, have sexual preferences, a la the asexual community, but also thinking about things like, even just like more trivially, like if you have debates about romance, like thinking about things like, how does this affect, for example, individuals who are currently single or have recently gone through a breakup or have a traumatic history with romantic relationships? So thinking about people who are not also just like the random, like, I don't know, Bachelor, like what's that show? The Bachelor or whatever it's called, like people who don't necessarily fit that type of mold. That's relationship debates. I'm gonna be fully honest with y'all. I'm not great at relationship debates, so don't ask me a ton about them because I'm less qualified to answer those than other questions. Okay, last thing I'm going to say in this presentation, and I do promise we'll get to the Kahoot for those of you who are still around. How many? 31 of you, 30 of you. That's impressive. Okay, last thing I'm going to chat about, and this is going to be brief, and it's deliberately brief because there's not that much I can tell you, but how do you debate really wacky motions? I'm going to talk about two types of wacky motions. The first basically is just like hypothetical technology motions. So those motions that are like, assuming the technology exists to blah, 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 this house would allow people to use the technology. The second type of wacky motions I'll talk about are kind of just the generic, like, whoa, bro, what on earth is going on here? Hint to any Americaners, that's not the word, Americans, that's the word. All of the NYPDL motions that are like, Kanye West in this song said this random ass lyric. Here's a motion about it. That fits into type number two. So type of wacky motion number one, hypothetical tech motion type things. First, biggest piece of strategy advice I'd give. And I know you're all thinking like, duh, obviously, but like spend time in prep thinking critically, but more importantly, asking questions. These debates are honestly in lots of instances hard to do well on if you like to some extent don't have a pretty, kind of like good idea of like what's going on. And the only way you can have a pretty good idea of what's going on is if you make like if in prep you consciously like ask yourself questions like, what's happening in this motion? What can this technology do? Who's going to use this technology? Blah, blah, blah. So I think that honestly, whenever you get a hypothetical technology resolution, the first thing that you should almost always do is just come up with a list of questions. And like you don't have to do this exactly, but ask yourself, what does this technology do? Who's using this? How expensive is it? What government regulations will exist around it? Will this be subsidized? Yada, 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 blah, blah, blah. The other thing, as a note, these motions are often kind of broken. And what I mean by that is they're often written in a way that's too vague. So often Gov has a little bit of flexibility when it comes to modeling things like, will everyone have access to it? Who will be able to use this? Stuff like that. So like if you're on Gov on these motions, it's often the case that these motions are kind of worded ambiguously. Weaponize that and take advantage of it. Not in abusive ways, just like if a motion doesn't make it very clear whether this technology is available universally, you can make arguments about why it's likely that it will. The other thing that's useful is to do analogies. So there's two ways in which I think this is useful. The first is I think it's helpful to ask yourself, what do we already have that's vaguely similar to this? And relatedly, if someone wants to do something, how would they currently do the thing that this technology allows them to do? So I think that, for example, there's a lot of arguments that will get run in debates about hypothetical technology that'll go like this. Oh no, this technology is bad because authoritarian governments are going to abuse it. So like, let's say you have a motion like this house prefers a world with the technology to erase people's memories, right? A very common op argument on that motion is like, but like China's going to abuse this. That's fine, but kind of like what we chatted about last week, I'm not convinced it's fully comparative. It's not like, right now, like, Kim Jong-un or whatever is like sitting in his like layers, like, eating donuts or whatever, and is like, I want to erase people's memories, but oh shucks, the technology doesn't exist. No, he just probably does other things that strive towards the same impact. So very oftentimes it's useful to ask yourself, what is the actual alternative to this technology? In some instances, there isn't any, right? Like if you have a motion that's like, I don't know, this house would allow people to buy and sell personality traits. Like, I mean, like people can try to change their personality traits, but like kind of wacky to think of a very clear example of a technology or thing that already exists that allows you to do that. But it's still worth thinking about like what are other things that already exist that people might use, or what are some reasonable analogies we can draw. Other thing, and this is kind of relatedly, think about who's actually going to use this technology. It's very tempting on there exists this technology, this house thinks it's good motion, to be like, oh, everyone will use it. That's not always true. And it's often useful to ask yourself critically, who's going to use this technology? Like, y'all, I got my first phone when I was in 7th grade. I just replaced it like last fall. Like I had that phone for like 6 or like 7 years or something. Cause like I'm deathly terrified of like new technology. I think refrigerators are like a horrifying invention. And I'm very scared of them. And I don't trust them almost at all. And I do not like it when the microwave hits 0 seconds because I think it's going to like absolutely like destroy the universe. This is mostly a joke, not the microwave thing. I don't think you should be allowed to let the microwave go to 0. But the point basically is just like a lot of people genuinely do not use new technologies, especially if they're really crazy radical. You know how there's those motions that are like, this house would allow people to buy and sell X part of their personality, like intelligence or humor or whatever, if the technology exists. Like in the real world, most people would not use this just because people are scared of technology. They don't know if there are side effects. Maybe the motion caveats there aren't. That doesn't mean people won't believe it. So you want to ask yourself, who's actually going to opt into this technology? Or of course you can say, how might governments, corporations, whatever, use or abuse this technology in bad or problematic ways? So asking yourself that question of how will this actually be used, as opposed to how will this in the abstract be used, can often be quite helpful. Second thing, there are just some topics that are really, really, really weird, confusing, wacky, dacky. I think that as a quick note to gov teams on NYPDL, or to teams, excuse me, in NYPDL, whenever you get those really wacky abstract motions like this house won't stop believing or whatever, I think, I'm going to be honest, I think 9 times out of 10, it's if you can pick gov, just do it. Maybe it's not the better side, but I do think there's a lot of benefit to picking gov. You clarify the debate, you get to set it up, you don't get blindsided by some wacky gov definition. And also just being PMR is a really good thing in that sort of position. In terms of actual strategies though, the first thing I'd say is that the wackier a motion gets, I think the more time you want to spend in prep, just genuinely thinking about the motion. Again, really basic advice, but I don't think it's probably used as much as it could be, maybe, arguably, and that applies to me as well. But like genuinely kind of thinking about, kind of like just spend more time figuring out what the clash is going to be and spend less time trying to come up with the third or fourth subpoint of an argument. In these debates, the reason why really wacky debates are weird is because it's very difficult to anticipate where the clash is going. The reason why in other debates it can be really helpful to try to come up with 3 or 4 sub-mechanisms or whatever is because you probably know roughly what the clash is, and now the question is just, how can we win the clash really clearly? When the motion has a very ambiguous clash, you want to spend more time identifying what the clash is going to be before you start coming up with your 17 subpoint arguments. Maybe that's just me, but definitely some people. The second thing is, the wackier a motion gets, the riskier and riskier it is to run increasingly esoteric arguments. So for example, someone who's Canadian, help me. What was that tournament that had that horrible motion? In my opinion, it was horrible, but it was really wacky. That was like, you are trapped in like a one day of your life thing. This house prefers a world where it's like the best day of your life.
Queens?
Yeah, Queens or whatever, right? Like that motion was like really, really wonky, wacky, weird. Like in that debate, offer a clear narrative for what you think this debate is. Like, what is the comparative? What are we talking about? And I honestly think that like, it's not a bad thing sometimes to start speeches being like, this is a really weird debate. Let me be very clear about what this debate is about and what this debate is not about. Sometimes maybe it means you go slower. Sometimes it means maybe you have to shave off a whole argument from your case. I think that the wackier a debate gets, the more and more cautious you should be about running increasingly fast arguments and increasingly confusing arguments. And the higher like level of complexity an argument requires, I think the slower you want to like talk when you explain it, and the more clearly you want to explain each link, and the more doubly you want to explain every link. So like saying things like, in other words, judge, here's what we mean by this. Even if you don't buy that, here's a second other warrant that functions fully independently. That's my advice for like very wacky motions. I'll be honest, this is of course very, very generic advice. I would say it's kind of important to be generic because you're never going to really know exactly what the clash is, but obviously trust your instincts. Like at some point in time, you're a good debater, just trust the process and do what you can. Okay, before we get to Kahooting, questions at all?
I know like 3 or 4 months ago, you were thinking about running a meme tournament. Are you still going to do that?
Yeah, at some point I will.
Okay.
Of course. Yeah, that was Sophie's idea. You can give Sophie credit for that. Other questions that folks have? I write great meme resolutions. I still, my favorite one is almost always going to be Marxist Easters versus Eaters. I can send the motion to anyone who wants it. Anyways, okay, if there are no other questions for now, I'll pause recording. Bye-bye recording people. See you in the future.